Once you've understood elements, and the basic elements required on an XHTML page, you'll want to style the layout of those elements. Cascading Style Sheets provides us with an elegant mechanism for styling our content without having to hard code that style inline in our XHTML structure. Let's explore how we can style the elements we've learned so far differently to the viewer without having to change the XHTML documents we have created. In this chapter, we'll explore how to create Cascading Style Sheets, or CSS, in detail. What are Cascading Style Sheets, often referred to as Style Sheets or CSS? As we've seen, Cascading Style Sheets are a markup language, just like HTML is, but with a different syntax. That markup language is used to describe the formatting, the look of an HTML file. One of the main benefits to us as web page creators of using Cascading Style Sheets is that it allows us to separate the formatting of an HTML file from the underlying architecture, the underlying structure of the HTML file. What does that mean? In previous lessons, we created titles and subtitles and paragraphs of copy. With style sheets, we saw that we could make all of our main titles a particular color and make our subtitles a separate color without having to edit the HTML itself. All we had to do was modify the rules that govern the presentation of that HTML. When we work with CSS, we define the rules which govern the format of HTML using selectors and then setting properties and corresponding values that should be assigned to those selectors, as we did with our main titles, our headings, the H1 tag, in a previous lesson. Style sheets can be used to define much more than just text formatting. We can use CSS in combination with HTML to govern the layout of our pages, adding space between the perimeter of where our text is and a background that we might like to see, the position of images on our page, and the creation of a layout structure, such as primary navigation, secondary navigation, the body content of our page. All of this can be controlled with CSS, manipulating an HTML architecture that you design. CSS is supported by all modern web browsers, with a few little nuances depending on the version of that web browser. CSS version 1, which came to us back in 1996, is universally supported by all current versions of web browsers. CSS version 2 from 1998 varies slightly browser to browser, and what I mean by varies is the CSS rules that you define may or may not work exactly the way you intended them to, depending on the version and platform you're on. So if you're designing on the Macintosh, for example, and previewing your code in Firefox, and you observe everything to look perfect, your job isn't done. You also need to realize that someone might be visiting your page on the PC using Internet Explorer. And if you're in a corporate context, you may find that 85% of your website visitors are visiting using Internet Explorer. If there's a problem, if the page doesn't look exactly the way you intended it to look on Internet Explorer, that's your problem. For our purposes throughout this tutorial, this won't be an issue. But it is something that you should consider and look for when you're testing your web pages. When you create CSS, the layout and formatting that you implement using those rules is flexible. You can update those rules after you create your HTML page, as long as you put a bit of planning into your design. Reiterating what we said before, website design is conceptually different than that of graphic design, in that when you're doing pure graphic design or desktop publishing, your planning is often done at the moment, the instant of execution. Meaning, if you draw a circle, you can see a circle. You draw a square, you can see a square. The time between thinking of what you want to see and executing on what you want to see is nearly instantaneous. With website design, there's a little bit of planning that has to occur between the two. As you get more and more experienced, that time will steadily decrease, to the point where you'll be almost as fast as people doing pure graphic design and desktop publishing. But for right now, we know that we need to think about what we want to design before we design it. Some of the benefits of style sheets that we're going to see are the ability to pull all of our style sheets into one central location and allow all of the pages in our website to look to that one location to retrieve the rules defining how the HTML contained within all of those pages are supposed to behave. Also, using CSS, we can define precise layout for how our web page is to be displayed and apply different layouts for different media types. What are different media types from a CSS point of view? So far, we've been looking at web pages with a screen media type. But you can use CSS to define rules unique to print. So when you go File and Print from a web browser, you may hide portions of code which are no longer relevant, such as navigation, or change the presentation of your document so that it's more applicable to a mobile device. Let's talk for a moment about how style sheets work. The syntax of CSS is very similar to that of HTML. Style sheets work based on the concept of a rule. That rule has two main components. It has a selector. That selector defines what HTML tags the CSS rules are intended to apply to, and the declaration block defines the properties and values that are to be implemented by the CSS. So in the example of a heading, the h1 tag defines the largest heading available to us in HTML. That's our selector. Our declaration block is the combination of property and value for that property. So in this case, color is our property. After our property, we define the value. We specify where the property ends with a colon. After the colon, we place a space, and then the value we wish to assign to the property, which comes before the colon. In this case, I put the hexadecimal value of red, which is defined by pound or hash symbol, FF0000, and I terminate my value with a semicolon. My declaration block itself is contained within curly brackets, and my selector is separated from my declaration block by a single space. There are three methods you can follow to apply style sheets to an HTML document. The first method is referred to as inline, where style sheets would be applied to an HTML tag as an attribute. Now you might say, why in the world would I want to do that? Isn't that the same thing as hard coding HTML values? Doesn't that defeat the purpose of style sheets? You would be correct. Generally speaking, you will not follow this method. In my own personal experience, there is one and only instance where inline CSS is useful and really the only way to go. That being when you're creating HTML emails. You probably get about 50 unwanted emails every day, almost all of which have graphics and text that look like web pages. Those actually are web pages, but they're not web pages out on a site. They're a web page emailed to you. An HTML designer had to create all of those HTML pages. But to ensure that your email client, which displays your email to you, displays the contents of that page properly, inline CSS effectively forces your email client to show the content properly. Different email clients can sometimes mangle HTML code, and if you're an email marketer, you want to make sure that you do everything that you possibly can to make sure that your emails are seen the way you intended them to be. Inline CSS is a very good way of doing that. The syntax for inline CSS is very similar to what we've seen before, except style sheets, rather than being defined elsewhere within our HTML page or in an external page are defined within the very element that you use to put your copy on the page. We've seen paragraph tags before in a previous lesson. In this short example, I've used style as an attribute of the paragraph tag, so *p space style as an attribute equals, and then my declaration block, property, colon, and value, semicolon, close quote. Again, very good for doing HTML emails, not terribly useful for anything else. The second method that you'll see when defining CSS is the internal method, putting CSS rules within the HTML file that you're working on. That's what we've done so far in our lessons. The CSS rules are declared within the head element inside your HTML file, and are then referenced by the HTML elements beneath. This method is not recommended for large websites. If you were making a website of 3 or 4 pages, it wouldn't take more than a few minutes to copy and paste these lines of code page to page. If your website had 500 pages, this method would represent a gigantic pain in the head. There are enough things in the world that give us headaches, we don't need another. So one way of removing this limitation is to pull all of our CSS together into its own separate file, and then associate the HTML pages that you're going to create with that separate file. This way, you can modify your CSS in one place. In our previous example, we had modified a heading tag. You can modify that heading tag in that separate CSS file, and then every single heading tag throughout your entire website would inherit that change. And we'll take a look at how to do that when we build multiple web pages and link backwards and forwards between them.